Well, while I was reading that part, I did have that on my mind. I was like, oh, God, I can't be relied upon as the philosophy guy here because Aristotle is a fucking chud. Hello.
Hey, welcome.
Welcome to Left Unread. My name is Aaron.
I'm Will.
We are two dudes engaging in a radical self-education.
Yes, we're simply two workers for which life does not entail toiling, sewing, seeding, digging, moving rocks, smashing things, but instead begins at the tavern table and in bed and etc. I wish I should have written it down. All right.
Yes, so we read One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse.
Yes. One-Dimensional Man was published in 1964 and is seen as a crucial part of the canon of critical theory. It contains a scathing critique of advanced industrial society steeped in the terror and threat of Cold War nuclear annihilation. Marcuse argues that technological rationality has warped our society in favor of domination, and this domination seeps into every aspect of our culture, absorbing the entirety of the other in ruthless conquest of nature and thusly of man. Seen as a critique of both post-war capitalism and Stalinized Soviet communism, One-Dimensional Man was critically influential on the movement of the New Left, spurring them to seek new and grand forms of organization.
That's great.
Thanks. It's true. You know, we joke about the New Left every now and then, but it was clear that they were not satisfied with the old forms of political organization and were, this might be part of their failure, but they were truly looking for a new form of society, which would then presuppose, communism or whatever, not, high stage communism. So, and I think that that's noble. I can also understand exactly where that comes from after reading this. If the idea that this technological apparatus, if it doesn't undergo some kind of qualitative change, then it will reinforce domination on our society, then we need a different apparatus, right? Yeah. So, that makes sense. It's not ignoble, I suppose, Ooh. I know, thank you. Yeah.
And as for our writer, Herbert Marcuse, German-born philosopher and critical theorist, Herbert Marcuse was one of, if not the most prominent member of the famous Frankfurt School, prominent institute of intellectuals examining the social and political order of the day. Born in Berlin in 1898, Marcuse would come to be called the guru of the New Left, little cultural appropriation there, a title which he rejected due to his acerbic critiques of capitalism, Stalinism, behaviorism, and fascism, among other things. Fleeing Germany in 1934, Marcuse came to live and work in the United States, from where he would write his most famous works. The aforementioned One-Dimensional Man and Eros and Civilization are the two, I think. Marcuse worked for the OSS and the U.S. State Department during World War II and in the years thereafter. As an anti-Nazi propagandist and analyst, nearly as inscrutable as his writing, Marcuse's persona is one bound often in seeming contradictions, the thesis and antithesis, if you will. Yet his work stands as an enduring insight into the thinking of one of the 20th century's most prominent intellectuals. So yeah, I think an important preface to this text.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm covering for my own insecurities by saying this, but I think that this is a book that is not, even if it was intended to be so, is not likely to be fully understood the first time you read it.
Yes.
And so I feel confident that there are things that we missed or maybe nuance that we're going to glaze over completely because we just aren't catching it on our first go-round.
Yeah, this was by far the hardest thing I think or I should say that it's the most challenging for me to have read so far in our short span. So I agree with you. Absolutely. What the issues for me are upon reading this book is that I don't understand. I don't understand. That is a big issue, right? It's that I'm missing a lot of the fundamental concepts that he elaborates on to then build his argument. And the problem there is that how willing am I to go back and try to fill those gaps in order to understand his message in this book? Probably not very willing.
Yeah, frankly, I do think that this is an interesting read and the ideas are rife for analysis, but I don't think there's anything in this book that you can't get from Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, which is 50 pages of bulleted lists.
Love that. Much
easier to understand, comprehend, and work with. And so, yeah, I don't know. There's a point where I'm not sure how much intellectual effort it's worth throwing into this text.
It's a funny. There's a bit of a contradiction there, I will say, because it's something he even mentions in the book where he's saying that, like, this chumminess of language is something that's required by the society. It's part of the domination. And here we are being like, this is long-winded, it's, overwrought, maybe his language isn't concise enough, or accessible enough. And it's like, I'm not saying that we're feeding into the technological apparatus of domination established.
The totalitarian technological
right.
state.
But, maybe his argument's a little self-serving there is all I'm thinking now.
Yeah,
where he's
exactly.
like, you've got to read all of this fucking... One thing I was saying earlier before we started recording was that he says the same thing so many times. I highlighted a lot. That looked like nothing when I just flipped through there, but I highlighted a fuck ton of this book. And upon looking through the highlights this morning to get my notes together, I was like, he's saying the same he's saying the same statement like a bunch of times throughout the whole book. And that's fine. That's fine. But just like you said, it's like how much of this is quite redundant,
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is necessary, and I do think his position on that is maybe apologia for his inability to write something compelling. But
is this where the classical image of like the fucking haughty philosopher comes from? Not this obviously specifically, but it's like this is just some pompous white guy sitting in his fucking room thinking about thinking, and nobody else can decipher it except for the other pompous white guys out there.
Yeah.
Which we are clearly not yet. We're not,
We haven't quite made it there. Yeah, I don't know. I have a thought on where we should start.
Sure.
I mean, the title is One-Dimensional Man. So
Yeah.
I think the first thing we should do is determine what is one-dimensional thinking and getting around some of the terminology that he's going to use in the text. Because I think that in and of itself is the start of the inscrutability of the text. So I will say I read the whole thing in 2 sittings. I read like the first 50-ish pages.
My God, man.
Yeah. And then I got busy with other stuff. And then 2 days ago or whatever, read the rest of it. And I just figured out, I think, exactly what it means to be a one-dimensional man on page 230. So, I mean, like, the fact that it took me that many pages, maybe it's a sign of my inability to interpret text, but I also think it is a good indication of what reading this book is like. But, like, it's important to recognize, I said the thesis and antithesis or antithesis thing in his introduction because I think that that's an important part of what the distinction he's making with one-dimensional and two-dimensional thinking. He calls it the positive and the negative.
Yeah.
How would you define it?
I think that it is tough because I think that when he's talking about it, I think the positive and the negative are really the clearest aspects because those are the 2 dimensions of thought in my mind, right? And what he's saying is that the flattening there is the absorption of the negative thinking into the positive thinking. So positive thinking would be something that reaffirms the society as a whole already. There is actually a part in here which I didn't mark the page of where he says like I'm actually using positive and positivism quite loosely here, and I have to explain that.
Yeah.
The idea, I think, the most crucial idea is not actually the positive there, but the negative. When he's talking about the possibilities of other, and he's talking about the possibilities of an alternative or even an element of refusal as a negative, I think that's a lot more defining than maybe what positive thought is, because all of positive thought is that reinforces what already is. So that's really where one-dimensional thinking comes into play here, is the idea that there is no alternative aside from what's already subsumed into the current.
Yeah, it gets co-opted, subsumed, and becomes that negative thinking becomes positive thinking. Therefore, we're existing only on one dimension.
Right. We're not actually exploring those alternatives, right? No matter how much we're saying them. In fact, one thing I really love is that he says that, this society creates a space for that alternative to stay in, because then that space is like a zoo. He doesn't say zoo specifically, but it's like a place where we can observe the alternative without actually interacting with it.
Yeah. Like outsiders, misfits.
Yeah, exactly. He says freaks, right? He's saying like these freaks. I actually have a quote mark. Let's dive in here. Yeah, I took a great class in college, actually part of my fucking advertising certificate, called Pop Culture and Graphic Design, where we talked about the idea of like the freak, like the other. And this was really reminiscent of that. It's on page 59. Yes, to be sure, these characters have not disappeared from the literature of advanced industrial society, but they survive essentially transformed. The vamp, the national hero, the beatnik, the neurotic housewife, the gangster, the star, the charismatic tycoon perform a function very different from and even contrary to that of their cultural predecessors. They are no longer images of another way of life, but rather freaks or types of the same life, serving as an affirmation rather than negation of the established order.
Exactly.
Yeah, so, it's interesting because I think even in the contrasting advanced industrial societies that he's talking about, it serves the same purpose, right? There's a great part where he's talking about how capitalism shows the weakness of communism, and communism shows the weakness of capitalism. And it's because those ideals stand in juxtaposition to each other, right? The ideal of communism stands as an other for capitalism to look at and say, this is the barbaric other, this thing in the distance that we have to protect against, right? I think that really lends itself to this kind of society. And much in the same way, he says that communist society exists on the notion of having to catch up and then surpass capitalist society.
Yeah.
You know what it actually really reminds me of? Just saying that now is in Black Skin, White Masks by Fanon. He says that to truly become black, you have to kill the white man and you have to kill the black man too, because the concept of black is only in relation to the concept of white. And it's in the same way, we can't experience this true communism, I suppose, while capitalism is still there, because that capitalism still exists as the other, which then defines our self.
Yeah, being defined by the negation, being defined by the opposite.
Right.
Nikki Giovanni said something very similar. She said, I'm going to paraphrase it, but she says there are two types of black folks I don't like, the master and the slave. And I think it speaks to that same sort of thing, this idea of identifying oneself as the antithesis of another thing means that you have this kind of dependence on that other thing existing to have any sort of positive existence yourself.
Yeah, and I love the way he talks about the transformation of Marxian language into Stalinist language even. It's like that Stalinist language represents the definition of communism in antithesis, the definition of post-war communism to post-war capitalism.
Yeah.
That's something really interesting here. Like I said, a lot of the critiques of Soviet communism are really interesting.
Yeah. I won't pretend to be an expert on the USSR or anything like that, but they all feel very apt to me.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up this section here, though, because I had the same page marked 59, because he's specifically talking about the way media gets used, and he calls out literature. Shout out, he calls out Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, a book I used to teach years ago, as an example. But he's kind of talking about this, and this also very similar to something Guy Debord says. I'm going to have a lot of trouble not just comparing this to Guy Debord all the time, but Debord calls it recuperation, where the sort of protest or quote negative thinking, how it gets subsumed by the mass status quo culture and then taken over as an object where it loses its teeth, so to speak, because it's like Coke's Pride cans and shit like that. You know what I mean? It's like exactly that sort of thing, where something that was once stood as a negation or in opposition to the ruling ideology becomes a part of the ruling ideology and therefore is no longer dangerous or de-weaponized. It's de-weaponized. And I think he's talking about literature. He seems to love stage plays also, by the way.
Yes, he does.
He's calling that out. And I think that that's really interesting because, I don't know, I still see a lot of that. You can see a lot of messages in modern media that, probably my favorite show on television right now is a show called Severance.
Yeah.
One of the most anti-capitalist shows you're ever going to see, but also the fact that it exists, it's also on Apple TV.
Right.
I mean, what the fuck? The idea that it exists and is allowed to exist is good evidence of the fact that it's not actually anything that can be useful to stand in opposition to the ruling ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so many anti-capitalist messages are utilized to try to build a more humane capitalism.
Yeah.
I think that happens all the time. And it's exactly what Marcuse is talking about here.
Yeah. Agreed.
Something else on page 59 that he talks about that I like is this kind of perversion of history, right? It's a little bit below. He says, the past culture expressed the rhythm and content of a universe in which valleys and forests, villages and inns, nobles and villains, salons and courts were part of the experienced reality. In the verse of prose in this pre-technological culture is a rhythm of those who wander and ride in carriages, who have the time and pleasure to think, contemplate, feel, and narrate. There is a part later on that I was thinking of here where he says, on page 72, he starts talking about libido, which... I couldn't help but laugh at. And
I wrote this is weird next to all the libido stuff.
A big old question mark. And I understand where he's coming from, but the part that's interesting here is that he says, this is the kernel of truth in the romantic contrast between the modern traveler and the wandering poet or artisan, between assembly line and handicraft. So he's juxtaposing the modern versus the antique. the ancient, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, this romantic pre-technical world was permeated with misery, toil, and filth, and these in turn were the background of all pleasure and joy. Still, there was a landscape, a medium of libidinal experience which no longer exists. It's this romanticism of the past, right? This
The
idea
pre-technological.
that there was this more freedom in a pre-technological past, when we know that that's not the case. If our measure of freedom is the suppression of need, the suppression of want, right, the suppression of scarcity, then where does that romanticism come from, right? This idea that the pre-technological world was somehow more free, when we know that objectively speaking, maybe operationally speaking, it's not the case. And he's saying that it comes from the fact that there was this medium there of, he says libidinal energy, but, a medium of maybe even possibility, a medium of instinctual response to the present society. I don't know where I was going with that one.
I was following you with everything you were saying there. I took that kind of line of thinking to be more around, this is a more surface level analysis, I think, than what you were getting at, but to be more around the idea that in the pre-technological era, we had fewer things distracting us in the form of things like media or other things that come with modernity that keep our minds focused on our jobs, on presenting an image of ourselves to others around us, whatever. We were less concerned about those things, which gave us more time for free thought or free activity, with his libidinal desires.
Yeah, but it's so interesting, though, because we know that that's not true, right? In like the objective.
Yeah.
Even in terms of time, like we simply have more time in this day to think, right? To do that kind of thinking. So I don't know. It's interesting there. One thing he talks about is the idea of modern culture still retaining an element of feudal culture where the privilege of like thinking, the privilege of deep thought is still limited to the very few.
Yeah.
And I don't know why, I'm not exactly sure. I mean, I do know why, because it is still the same, but
I don't know. I mean, I think if I was going to respond to that from my perspective after having read this text, I think the answer is the reason that freedom is reserved for the privileged few is because we, as the workers, the dominated class, the one-dimensional dominated class, I guess, are so fixated on this idea of having a purpose, having a place, being a version of ourselves that is in line with the dominant ideology, that all of our energy is put into that. And so we don't have any actual freedom to think about anything other than that. We're so...
Even in our free time, we're still thinking
it.
about the same thing.
Yeah.
Because our thoughts are determined by the society around us. There's not that inner space, right? He talks about that inner private space, and he's saying it's being invaded by all the different elements of society. So he's saying even when we find the time to have those private thoughts, it's still being completely controlled or completely influenced by our technological society around it.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That took me a second there.
This actually kind of relates to the quote that I think helped me understand what one-dimensional thinking was.
Yeah.
It's way back on page 230. It reads, "This universe is never coextensive with the established one, but extends to the limits of the world, which can be created by transforming the established one, with the means which the latter has provided or withheld. The range of verifiability in this sense grows in the course of history. Thus, the speculations about the good life, the good society, permanent peace, obtain an increasingly realistic content. On technological grounds, the metaphysical tends to become physical."
Yeah.
And I was interpreting that to be all about these imposed limits. We have this shrinking possibility, this narrowness that gets imposed upon us. So we see now the limits of our freedom as those walls that have been imposed upon us that are shrinking further and further and further and further down. So we're no longer even concerned with the idea of being able to think freely because we see the outer limits of what we are allowed to think. We have now redefined those outer limits as the ability to think freely, not realizing that there's no freedom in that at all.
It's still contained within the walls.
And so we're still trapped in this one-dimensional positive thinking. I think that that's a really compelling and powerful idea that I wish he would have said on page 2.
Yeah, instead of 230.
Yeah.
It's obviously not my wheelhouse, but it reminds me of The Cave, right? Where, all you see is the shadows and that's your whole world. It's the same thing. It's like the walls we don't interpret as walls. We think of them as like literally the limit when in fact there is something beyond that.
Yep.
And it's just that our society has cornered our thinking. It has eliminated the possibility of even realizing those alternatives outside of the realm of our own possibility.
Exactly. And he does call out Plato's allegory of the cave
Yeah.
partway through the middle of the text there.
Yeah. In fact, there's something I think he says early on. The assimilation of the ideal with reality testifies to the extent of which the ideal has been surpassed. It is brought down from the sublimated realm of the soul or the spirit or the inner man and is translated into operational terms and problems. Here are the progressive elements of mass culture. The perversion is indicative of the fact that advanced industrial society is confronted with the possibility of the materialization of ideas. So it's in that same conquest of nature. It's like we have extended technology, right? Technical rationality to the point where these ideal concepts, these utopian concepts, are confronted with the fact that they can be realized. It reminds me of like the primary contradictions here, where we understand that we have enough for everybody, but we still live in a world of exploitation and suffering.
Yep.
We can see clearly that our technology is capable of harnessing nature to the point where everybody's needs can be taken care of, but we still exist in this world of this crazy exploitative death drive.
Yep. That quote that you read on page 59, I had a few others that I marked along with it that I think are related to this idea of, quote, alternatives in the media being used to simply reinforce the status quo. In the middle, he also has this really interesting thing about the use of the word romantic,
Okay.
which maybe I want to talk about, but I don't know what I want to say about it. Let me point you to page 61.
Okay.
Because on 61, he's talking about that kind of recuperation, as DeBow calls it, about how the negative gets subsumed and becomes the positive. At the top of the page, he says, what has been invalidated, talking about literature that once maybe was kind of being used in this sort of way.
Yeah.
He says, what has been invalidated is their subversive force, their destructive content, their truth. And in this transformation, they find their home in everyday living. And it's the exact same sort of thing. He continues there on that same page at the very last line of the next paragraph. In the realm of culture, the new totalitarianism manifests itself precisely in this harmonizing pluralism where the most contradictory works and truths peacefully coexist in indifference.
Yeah.
It's that primary contradiction all over again.
It's the same thing when he talks about the classics, how the fact that labeling a classic robs it of its antagonistic power to be the classical piece of literature that it is.
Yeah, Bovary is a perfect example of that.
It's like when we were talking about Romeo and Juliet, and I was like, everyone hates it because they have to read it, but it's actually really good. Or, it's that same thing, though. It's like by the labeling of it is something that everyone like has to read to understand society as a whole. It is taken. I mean, that essence of it is taken.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's another part where he says the same thing. On page 71, the psychiatrist takes care of the Don Juans, Romeos, Hamlets, Fausts as he takes care of Oedipus. He cures them. The rulers of the world are losing their metaphysical features. Their appearance on television, at press conferences, in parliament, at public hearings is hardly suitable for drama beyond that of an advertisement. The soul contains few secrets and longings which cannot be sensibly discussed, analyzed, and polled. So, yeah, he talks a lot about privacy, not only that internal privacy, but also the privacy granted by society, where much in the same way you were saying that the thought is being closed in by these walls, he says the same thing about apartments, right? It's like this socialized housing is actually like literally eliminated our physical space for privacy.
Yeah.
I mean,
true.
even in a factory, even in think about an open air office, it's like you can see what everyone's doing.
Yeah.
Much in the same way. It's like, it's that same thing. It's the privacy is being diminished for domination.
Yep. Maybe to bring us back toward the beginning of the book, the first thing that really jumped out to me was his, what I was calling internalized alienation. He's talking a lot about this early on page 11. Yeah, on page 11, he's talking about alienation, and he's talking about the self, the ego in introjection, and he talks a lot about capital R reason.
Yeah.
And as he's doing that, on the first full paragraph in the middle of the page, he says, I have just suggested that the concept of alienation seems to become questionable when the individuals identify themselves with the existence which is imposed upon them and have it in their own development and satisfaction. The subject which is alienated is swallowed up by its alienated existence. I guess the only thing I want to say about that is we become agents of our own destruction, agents of our own demise by falling victim to this kind of what I called internalized alienation. I mean, all alienation is internalized, but this is where we take it on as the agent of that alienation and turn it inward and impose those limits upon ourselves, or at least how I'm interpreting it. And I think that that is very dangerous. And I think a big part of where we run into hurdles with class consciousness, where we run into hurdles with mobilization and creating coalition, because we have, even as members of the same, dominated class, the same marginalized class, being proletarians, being whatever that class, however you want to put it, being proletarians, even though we share that same form of domination, we ourselves are not all seeing it that way, because many of us, or all of us to a degree, fall victim to weaponizing it against ourselves.
Yeah, there's two things here. First, on page 6, he says something very interesting where it's just quite frank, where he says, how can the people who have been the object of effective and productive domination by themselves create the conditions of freedom?
Yep.
In the introduction, he says that the hypothesis is two things. Not only does technological society dominate, right, but the technological society also contains the probability that he doesn't say probability. What does he say? He says, forces and tendencies exist which may break this containment and explode the society. So that's the big unknown in this for me, is that I can agree with him that the technological apparatus creates a system of domination. I think that that's quite well argued, and I think it makes sense. I think it's even interesting to think about how our endless conquest of science has pinned us into that kind of domination. It's interesting because I don't think that, obviously, most people wouldn't say that, right? Most people wouldn't say that following this scientific method is not going to, it will lead to more freedom, right? Because we have a greater control over our resources. But he's saying that part of that resource is our own labor. But at the same time, there is a fragment. There is something in that labor that can then reach beyond the walls, that can then reach beyond society. I don't know where that actually is. He does a lot to talk about the issue here, but he doesn't do anything to talk about the solution,
It's
and
relatively
I know
common in
that might be crazy for me to ask, to just be like, what is the answer? But he really just says something else. He really just says another form is possible. I don't know if I see his second point, that there do exist forces that can explode this society. I don't think that that's arguable, but I don't see what they are, and I don't think this book helped me to see it at all. In fact, it really just confused me. Yeah, that's just my big contention with this book, because, like you said, he says the same thing a bunch. So, once I've agreed with it the first time, it's now what, you know? I didn't need to go past page 60 for this. That's really how I felt, is that the beginning of the book was strong and the end of the book was strong for the most part. I was excited when he said, what's the possible alternative? But then he didn't give any really possible alternatives there.
I have a quote that's kind of related to what you're saying, but it's not concrete. He's still living in the abstract, and it's right where you're at. It's on page 7.
Okay, which I highlighted so much of this fucking page.
Yeah, well, it looks like we highlighted the opposite things like usual. But in the kind of middle of that top paragraph, he says, all liberation depends on the consciousness of servitude. The emergence of this consciousness is always hampered by the predominance of needs and satisfactions, which to a great extent have become the individual's own. I took that initially to be kind of about what we had said in previous episodes about the first revolution. It has to occur in the mind. You have to recognize through your own consciousness, you hold within yourself the means of your own liberation. But I think talking about it the way we're talking about it now, I'm seeing it here as him kind of pointing out the fact that the means of liberation do exist within this society. It just comes down to our consciousness of them. So it's less on the individual and more a social form.
Yeah. Well, he even says that about the Marxian ideal of revolution, where he says that the consciousness is the big part of it, right? Where you have to build the public conscious before a revolution can happen. Yeah,
and turning false consciousness to true consciousness. He uses that phrase a lot.
Yeah, and that makes sense. There is a definition where he says specifically about false and true needs, actually, on page 4. Because he says, what does it mean to be true or false? To be false means that it comes from the influence of the society without, rather than the actual internal needs,
Yeah. let's go to page 125.
All right.
Okay, so yes, I think it's already abundantly clear to anybody listening to this that you and I found this book to be a bit of a slog, and it certainly slumps in the middle when he gets deep into his philosophical train of thought.
Yeah.
And I love philosophy. I've been a self-studier of philosophy for the last 25 years, Jesus Christ. And even I found this to be pretty difficult to get at. But he is talking here on 125 about something that I think brings up a larger question, or call it criticism, of this book. Because he's talking about epistemology. Epistemology from philosophy is really just about the study of knowing, the study of knowledge, where it comes from, how do we know what we know, blah, 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 blah. And he says on 125, if man has learned to see and know what really is, he will act in accordance with truth. Epistemology is in itself ethics, and ethics is epistemology.
I highlighted that.
That's a really interesting take, to conflate knowledge and ethics.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that sat with me for a while. As he was continuing on, he says in the next paragraph, to the extent to which the experience of an antagonistic world guides the development of the philosophical categories, philosophy moves in a universe which is broken in itself. It is two-dimensional. Appearance and reality, untruth and truth are ontological conditions.
Yeah. That's the part of the philosophy section here that really spoke to me, is when he's talking about the difference between the reality of a thing and our perception of a thing. And I don't think it's in exactly this section here, but he's saying that that gap between what we're saying with our language, what we're even saying with our own recognition, and the reality, whatever that might be, is there's something in there. But I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, so that's exactly the same line of reasoning that I was going on. And I was like, okay, maybe this is about to start picking up. And then, flash forward to page 134, he's talking about the way philosophy has been practiced. And he's talking about Socratic discourse. The Socratic method is very famous. It's a form of questioning to find our knowing, right?
Yeah, you probably did it in high school, listener.
Yeah, you probably did some sort of Socratic seminar. And he's calling it out. He says, thus, the Socratic discourse is political discourse inasmuch as it contradicts the established political institutions. The search for the correct definition for the concept of, and he gives examples, virtue, justice, piety, and knowledge, becomes a subversive undertaking. And again, I thought that was really intriguing. The idea of merely working through the process of questioning something is in and of itself a subversive act, and in and of itself leads us to a deeper movement toward an epistemological understanding of the world.
Yeah.
I'm still with him there, but he just keeps fucking going. And he says, critical philosophic thought is necessarily transcendent and abstract, for nobody really thinks who does not abstract from that which is given, and abstractness is the very life of thought, the token of its authenticity. And then he's talking about Platonic ideals. Okay, at what point are we just parsing this two-dimensional thought to the point that it halts us and becomes not only not productive, but counterproductive?
It's curious because it's exactly what he says about linguistic analysis, that the constant trying to parse the languages is a reductive process,
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that.
I was just baffled because, again, as a person who likes to think in the abstract, I like to live in the abstract and think about what we know, how we know it, why it's important to know. Those questions are interesting questions to me, but also sitting around twiddling my thumbs asking questions like that doesn't do anything to change the material conditions of the world in which I am allowed to ask them.
Right.
And so at what point does our focus on that sort of 10th level abstract thinking become counterproductive? And I think it's a really interesting position to take as someone whose writing is, I'm just going to keep calling it inscrutable, to the point that it's what's your fucking deal, man?
Well, I think it keeps wrapping around itself. I mean, I really like what you just said there, because he says it earlier on. I actually marked this on page 15, right? Such limitation of thought is not new. Ascending modern rationalism in its speculative and empirical form show a striking contrast between extreme critical radicalism in scientific and philosophic method, right? Just like we're talking about, we're really, really thinking this through, and then uncritical quietism in the attitude towards established and functioning social institutions. It's like you're writing this in academia as well, man.
Yeah.
At what point is this thinking doing anything to actually move the needle, he does say that it all depends on the historical context. There's a lot that he says ultimately boils down to historicism, right, to the historical record. That's really what qualifies the thought in the concrete, is that it is done through historical practice. Yeah, because it's about what it is versus what ought to be, right? In the same way of, he's saying the practice makes it concrete, right? Much in the same way, we keep thinking about like this inscrutable ideal, like maybe even higher phase communism. It's like, at what point is that lack of practice actually confining it? You know, the actual historical experience of practicing socialism tells us one thing in a reality, and that, you know, in this case, it's like the Stalinized technological apparatus of the Soviet communism or whatever. But it's that thing you were just talking about, right? How much of this like fucking ideological circle jerking is going to actually change the practice, when in reality what is doing it is the Soviets, right? The actual real practice in history.
Yeah, actually existing socialism versus our utopian idea of what socialism can be.
What socialism is versus what socialism ought to be.
Yep.
Right? Yeah.
There is also, I think... we shouldn't approach this without any sense of self-awareness and recognize that the act that we are currently doing is not all that different from this same idea of like shit sniffing or whatever.
Yeah.
And like, what are we actually doing to change anything by sitting around and talking about people that are talking about changing things?
Yeah. Well, I mean... One thing I loved, this is totally unrelated to the scope of the book or anything, but when he's talking about the ideal of beauty, and he's saying that all of the different definitions of beauty might try to quantify this abstract ideal, the only one that actually does it in my mind is the most abstract of them all, where he says that beauty is the promise of happiness.
Yeah.
That was gorgeous, you know, and it was untranslated. I had to put it into Google Translate. What if I was in 1964, Marcuse? Then what?
Yeah, that section on aesthetics and on beauty was kind of interesting. Page 210.
210, okay.
Here's what's interesting, because the beauty example is actually a good example of how language can be kind of amorphous.
Yeah, I have that whole fucking paragraph because it's great.
Yeah, it's permeable. He calls them universals, but talking of a beautiful girl, a beautiful landscape, a beautiful picture. I certainly have very different things in mind. What is common to all of them? Beauty is neither a mysterious entity nor a mysterious word. It is experienced almost as a shock, perhaps due to the contrast character of beauty, which breaks the circle of everyday experience and opens, for a short moment, another reality of which fright may be an integral element. So you can use the same word to describe all of these disparate things, even though beauty stands as some sort of universal absolute or something like that. It's like a really interesting idea.
It is, because, I mean, it goes hand in hand with what he's saying, where the alternative, the other, is actually what gives it its value, right? The fact that it exists outside of the realm of the immediate, you know, that contrast character that he's talking about, it's breaking the circle of everyday experience, right? It's not within the positive experience, but it's in fact within the negative.
Yeah.
You know, that's actually, word to that. But he does that about a lot of stuff with language. I mean, I love, even back on like page 180, can the most exact and clarifying description of tasting something that may or may not taste like pineapple ever contribute to the philosophic cognition? What I wrote there was that saying it tastes like chicken makes it taste like chicken, you know? It's interesting stuff. He also, did you look up where he mentions linen in the glass of water there?
Oh, no.
This was so strange. He talks about an example with linen where he sees a glass of water on the table and he's like, oh, you know, you only think this is a glass of water because of so many things. You know, it could be a cylinder of glass or a tube or something like that. Just I had never heard of that before.
Yeah, nor I. I am curious there is something from the text that I wanted your take on, because I wasn't sure I was understanding what it was. And this is moving us back again.
Okay.
Back to page 84.
All right.
What he calls the happy consciousness.
Yeah.
The happy consciousness, he defines it as the belief that the real is rational and that the system delivers the goods, reflects the new conformism, which is a facet of technological rationality translated into social behavior. I mean, I think I get that on an elemental level. I think I get what he's saying there. It's like, it's a blindness, so to speak.
Yeah,
right? It's
like an overlooking of the actuality.
Is there something in this that I'm missing, why this is a relevant part of his theory? Because it seems kind of self-evident to me.
I think that it's a immediate reflection of their history. You know, especially because they're all German and they had to flee Germany from the Nazis. I think that the Nazis and fascism weigh very heavily on the Frankfurt School's mind. And I think that this is part of that. The Germans experienced what they thought was freedom. They held a happy consciousness, even though the underlying aspects of their society were based on torture and death and wartime. I mean, that's kind of what it reminded me of when he's talking about a happy consciousness there. There is another little section where he says a happy consciousness just a couple pages earlier on page 79. Yeah, actually, I even wrote here, just on page 78, Cold War, nuclear annihilation, right? Has it attained a degree of normalization where the individuals are getting used to the risk of their own dissolution and disintegration in the course of normal national preparedness? Or is this acquiescence entirely due to their impotence to do much about it? Yeah. So much like you say, it's that blindness. It kind of reminds me of like a learned helplessness. It's like I have nothing else to do about the society, so I must simply exist within it. That's the happy consciousness in my mind.
I think he's taking it a step further, though, and saying that not just like we're aware and then become ambivalent, but that we actively participate in the creation of the means of our own destruction I think as a part of that.
I think that he's saying that there isn't an awareness, right? He's saying that that it's almost like your thoughts are controlled by the society around it. A little bit further on 79, he talks about the destruction instinct, right? The death instinct. The part that I was looking at is a little further down, where he says, the result of the atrophy of the mental organs for grasping the contradictions and the alternatives in the one remaining dimension, the happy consciousness comes to prevail. So it's not just like I understand it and I'm not accepting it or I'm blind to it. Well, maybe blind to it is a better way, but he's saying that like there is no option other than to maintain that happy consciousness. Like that's the consciousness that's left over. After your conscious ability to interpret the alternatives is reduced by living in the society, that's what's left over. That's kind of what it said to me. I don't know how valid that is, but...
Yeah, I feel like we have slightly different takes on it. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe I'm thinking of it too individualistically, and he's talking about it more socially, because he does say on 78, this society turns everything it touches into a potential source of progress and of exploitation, of drudgery and satisfaction, of freedom and of oppression.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm thinking of it on an individual level when we're talking about the happy consciousness, but maybe he's talking about it as some sort of social consciousness where it's like we participate in it. In order to participate in it, we have to accept both the thesis and antithesis.
Yeah. It's interesting because, it's the flattening of I'm getting a little lost here because it's saying that the flattening of those two ideas, these two opposites into one ideal is part of the one-dimensional society. But at the same time, he also says that... drudgery and satisfaction, freedom and oppression. There's a lot of talk where he's saying like that the opposite is taking over the main meaning. Like when he talks about capitalism and communism and he says,
I remember that.
I got to look at the quote. That quote was a banger. But that's the thing. I can't even say that it's a banger because in order for it to bang, I had to read 200 other pages of dog shit. The fact that the prevailing mode of freedom is servitude and the prevailing mode of equality is superimposed inequality is barred from expression by the closed definition of these concepts in terms of powers which shape the respective universe of discourse. It's interesting because what he's saying actually it entails the opposites.
There is something to that. What's interesting is that, I don't know how to say this, when you know that I used to run school. One of the things that we would talk about, or at least when I went through the program, one of the things that what came up was that when you say a word, like for example, an identity marker, you think from the perspective of the dominating class.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you say the word gender, that has a connotation for most to think of women.
Yeah.
Because the assumption, it's an androcentric assumption in that case, that like the assumption is everything starts with men, and then when you say gender, you're talking about something other than men, and so therefore it's defined by its antithesis. The concept of gender is defined by femininity or non-masculinity.
Yeah.
The same way to say race is to talk about all marginalized races.
Non-whiteness.
To say sexuality is to talk about non-heteronormativity, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so it becomes defined by its antithesis, at least in the eyes of the prevailing social order. You can't define the term without its antithesis in those cases.
What it's making me think of is when he talks about, when a man says something, he's not just saying what the man is saying, but also what his owners are saying, right? What his society is saying. So it's interesting to me. I was just thinking that if society is absorbing those negative meanings, then that negative meaning is then imparted on our positive communication, I guess. Do you know what I mean? Maybe the inclusion of the antithesis in the definition is part of the fact that society imparts its inclusion of the antithesis in its society onto its inhabitants. Do you know what I mean?
I think so, because it's been sublimated, because it's become all one thing, because it's all been amalgamized into this single entity. You can't define freedom without slavery being a part of that definition because of that sublimation.
Yeah. I don't know, man.
No. We're getting in the weeds on it a little bit.
This is my dumb brain. Okay, whatever. Sorry, I just he's so weird about sexuality, man. I was just looking, I opened up to page 73 and I was just looking at compare lovemaking in a meadow and in an automobile, on a lover's walk and on the Manhattan street. The environment partakes and invites libidinal cathexis. What does that mean?
That's what I'm saying, man. That's weird. I just wrote, this is weird next to that, because like there are many examples that could be used why this Freudian obsession with the libido.
Yeah, clearly I'm not well versed in psychoanalysis. I also love on page 27 when he quotes Sartre and he's like,
oh god,
that was a crazy footnote. I literally just wrote like, LOL, what?
Yeah.
Where he says, shortly after semi-automatic machines were introduced, investigations showed that female skilled workers would allow themselves to lapse while working into a sexual kind of daydream. They would recall the bedroom, the bed, the night, and all the concerns only the person within their solitude of a couple alone with itself. I just bungled that sentence too. But man, what the fuck is he talking about, dude?
Yeah, Sartre, I like a lot of what he has to say about his version of existentialism. He was a fucking creep. He was one of the people that signed the consent law thing, saying that you could be 14 and be of the age of consent or whatever. He was a fucking creep.
Lit.
Yeah.
Lit. Oh, yeah, these were nice. The examples that illustrate the marriage of positive and negative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so that was the topic. It was the harmony between rationality and irrationality. Mm-hmm. The quote, the absorption of the negative by the positive is validated in the daily experience, which obfuscates the distinction between rational appearance and irrational reality. And then he gives us a number of examples, banal examples, he calls them. Riding in an automobile, taking a walk in the country, and riding the subway.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something interesting inside of all of this. He says that these examples, maybe we should give one of the examples.
Okay, sure.
Let's go with the country one. I take a walk in the country. Everything is as it should be. Nature at its best. Birds, sun, soft grass, a view through the trees of the mountains. Nobody around. No radio. No smell of gasoline. Then the path turns and ends on the highway. I'm back among the billboards, service stations, motels, and roadhouses. I was in a national park, and I now know that this was not reality. It was a, quote, reservation, something that is being preserved like a species dying out. If it were not for the government, the billboards, hot dog stands, and motels would long since have invaded that piece of nature. I am grateful to the government. We have it much better than before. And this is the rationality of irrationality that he's talking about. And he's explaining it with this example where he recognizes the beauty of nature, then is suddenly confronts what has bastardized nature, the post-technological world, the industrialized world. But then the thought of this person is, thank God for this industrialized world, for preserving this tiny reservation of nature for me to continue to live this experience that I had. Yeah. And that you walk away with a rational irrationality where you're like happy that this tiny space has not been invaded.
No, I'm really glad you brought this up because I think that especially the reservation of the other is really what speaks to me here. You know, it reminds me when he's talking about culture and he says that like theaters and art houses and all of these exist as like a new construction in order to hold that antithesis, right? It's like that space that the other can live in and be observed, you know, the zoo, like we were saying. Yeah. That's what it really reminds me of there. And there was another thing that I've already forgotten about here. Oh, yeah. Harmonizing plurality is something he mentions early on. I think it's on page 61. In the realm of culture, the new totalitarianism manifests itself precisely in a harmonizing pluralism, right? So the most contradictory works in truth peacefully coexist in indifference, right? We read that earlier. There's something he says, I thought it was on the page before, but it's not, where he says that a pluralistic administration, a pluralistic totalitarianism is better because the administrations kind of compete with each other, right? It's like I can hide from one under the other. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of what it reminds me of here. It's like they keep this reservation, so you can go and experience the natural beauty. And then once you get back into the regular world, you realize like this was here so I could see it as the opposite,
Well, he says that these examples may illustrate the happy marriage of the positive and the negative, the objective ambiguity which adheres to the data of experience. So like the weird experience that we go through, let's put ourselves in the shoes of this walker, the one that's taking this walk through nature. We somehow blaze past the observation that industrialization is what has robbed the rest of my experience of living this bliss, the bliss of no smell of gasoline, no sound of a radio, the beautiful scenery or whatever. But for whatever reason, we blaze past that contradiction and recognize in thankfulness that the industrialized world has allowed this space to continue to persist. I mean, there's something similar there with that, like, these are the spaces that are relegated for the freaks. So we're thankful that those spaces exist so we can live in contrast to those. There's something really weird in that.
Well, yeah, there is. I think it's in the sentence where he says, things are much better than before because they are on an objective level, just like that romanticism of history that we were talking about.
Yeah.
But
we never came back to that.
It doesn't matter, whatever. there is a possibility of an alternative, right? In this case, the alternative is nature is the main society, Mm-hmm. That harmony is one that is created by the connection between those two things, and that harmony is not the only possibility. It's just that the society we live in has delineated our idea of possibility to the point where, that's our conclusion.
It's that closing in.
Yeah, it's that, I'm glad that this exists because the alternative in our mind is that it does not exist, right? It's just industry. It's just the smell of gasoline. It's just the billboards. The having it there as the opposite is that harmonizing effect. It's part of what's closing us in is the idea that we can see the other there and have it there.
Yeah, it's like it's a placating.
Yeah.
Because it's like we still have it.
Right.
Not that it's like been robbed from us.
The alternative, there are alternatives that are outside of this schema. I mean, that's simply it. It's just that the world that we are living in doesn't allow us to even see them. There's a part later where he talks about Occam's razor, right? And he says that it's really just a matter of what you allow to be possible. On page 216, it all depends on how Occam's razor is applied. That is to say, which possibilities are to be cut off. The possibility of an entirely different societal organization of life has nothing in common with the possibility of a man with a green hat, right? Something nonsensical happening.
Yeah.
Because, that might be what you say in reply, like, well, what if the world was made of pudding? But it's like, there are possibilities. Like, where do you draw the line? You do draw the line somewhere. It's just that our society has drawn the line at, we're going to do advanced industrial society. We're going to do technological domination of nature. And that domination of nature is leading to the domination of man. There is an alternative possible, right? It is possible, as he says in the end, to not dominate nature, but to pacify it, right? It's no longer that we're conquering, but we're living in peaceful coexistence with it, right? That's the kind of alternative that we need to be able to see. It's just that our society has conditioned us to think that that's impossible, to think that it's a freak, to think that it's in the utopian schema. Like that I think is really important to me. And it's the thing he's been saying the entire book, it's just that like there are other possibilities there.
Yeah, I'm finally putting together the pieces of the puzzle that's what he meant at the end when he comes to the pacified existence.
Yeah, that took me a second too because it sounds like, pacification. He does talk a little bit about like degrowth. That was something that was interesting to me because it's in contrast to maybe the classic Marxist idea where we build up and build up and build up this technology and then we seize the apparatus, but there's a qualitative change. That's what Marcuse says, right? Yeah. He's saying that there is an alternative that exists outside of that buildup, right? Or even that buildup can be halted because the usefulness of the scientific method is no longer necessary for domination. It's instead only being used for what we initially wanted it to do, which is to pacify the needs of man, right? To eliminate the toil and destruction of the nature around us. That I think actually was pretty nice. Like I said, the end of the book, he does bring it back together. It's just that I was already so pissed off by the time I got to that point that it really devalued the message.
Yeah.
There is a little bit about degrowth that I wanted to talk about there, because he says something interesting. He says is that the standard of living attained in most advanced industrial areas is not a suitable model of development if the aim is pacification. The question has ceased to be irresponsible since the affluent society has become a society of permanent mobilization against the risk of annihilation, and since the sale of its goods have been accompanied by moronization, the perpetuation of toil, and the promotion of frustration. On the contrary, I skipped a little bit, the elimination of profitable waste would increase the social wealth available for distribution. Okay, and then I'm going to skip a lot here, because at the bottom of 243 he says, a new standard of living adapted to the pacification of existence also presupposes the reduction in the future population. That was curious to me because it goes against my ideal of everyone do what they need to. It is interesting though, because he continues that quote, right? It's understandable, even reasonable, that industrial civilization considers legitimate the slaughter of millions in war, the daily sacrifice of all those who have no adequate care or protection, but it discovers its moral and religious scruples if it is the question of avoiding the production of more life in a society which is still geared to the planned annihilation of life. That really spoke to me. And degrowth is something I haven't really struggled with. I'm willing to accept that because I guess I haven't really considered the scale of its meaning, but it's interesting here to see Marcuse talk about the fact that, the kind of society we're envisioning does entail a decrease in production. And if we're linking production with population, that means that the population also decreases.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's like violent or fucking, it's not like we need to massacre the top 300,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
But, it is something that has to be considered. I don't know. Degrowth is an interesting side of Marxism that we haven't done anything about, obviously, but it could be interesting.
When I was reading this, again, I was kind of over it by the time I was this deep in the book, but the connections I was making were more around imperialism, because he says even farther down there on 244, the drive for more living space operates not only in international aggressiveness, but also within the nation. Here, expansion has, in all its forms of teamwork, community life, and fun, invaded the inner space of privacy and practically eliminated the possibility of that isolation of the individual.
Did you catch, by the way, living space in quotes there is a direct reference to the Nazis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Hitler's explanation for expansion is that the Germans needed Lebensraum, which is literally living room. Okay? Yeah. So
yeah, that blazed right by me.
Yeah, that was another connection right there for me where I was like, oh, this is something that's like World War II influenced, And not that it's just interesting to see that. I didn't know if you had picked up on that. That's why I asked.
No. But again, it comes back to that. There is a finite amount of resources, especially if we stop production, there will be a finite amount of resources or reduce production. And that comes with it all of these other kind of considerations that have to be made. But even before we've done that, we already, like he says, get it into our minds that it's okay to have war that causes the mass annihilation of millions of people, the destruction of all these different things. Because, we need more, so we can take it after we do that, too.
Right. Well, yeah, it was interesting to me just now when you said, it's like allowable losses. We've primed ourselves to accept these casualties because
collateral damage.
Yeah, exactly. We think about it as the price of modern society, the price of modern industry. It made me think of the victims of communism, honestly, because how we were saying, if you measured the victims of capitalism, it would be tons and tons and tons. But we don't, because those victims are already accepted by us, right? They're already internalized.
They're in the ledger book already.
Yeah, exactly. It's already in our conception. It almost makes me think of it being like an antithesis, right? It's like the people that live versus the people that die. We've already accepted the people that die into the definition of the people that live, right? The part of good living is the part where people are dying in the background. It's just that when we then have, it's actually that same blindness. We cannot accept that aspect of society because it is the antithesis which has been subsumed. If you're a critical theorist, please let us know what the fuck we just said at leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com, please.
There's a really great quote on 240 related to degrowth. In this case, the conquest of nature reduces the blindness, ferocity, and fertility of nature, which implies reducing the ferocity of man against nature. Cultivation of the soil is qualitatively different from destruction of the soil, extraction of natural resources from wasteful exploitation, clearing of forests from wholesale deforestation. Poverty, disease, and cancerous growth are natural as well as human ills. Their reduction and removal is liberation of life. And back to the point about parsing and how I found a lot of this to be very kind of tiresome. This is, I think, an important point.
Yeah.
And something to call back to something that I'd mentioned in a previous episode. I think words do matter, and I think it is important for us to use them deliberately and intentionally. Like, there is a difference between destruction and cultivation.
Yeah.
And to use something is not to destroy it. In this case, talking about the soil. To extract is not to exploit all of the time. If you can do it mindfully, that's the way you can actually sustain life and do it well. Things like disease and cancer do occur naturally. They also are exacerbated by a human intervention. And so, like, to claim that our intervention is the cause is not an entire truth, but also like, it's important for us to recognize that we are a cause that exacerbates and makes it worse.
I just had two thoughts.
Yeah.
One, earlier when he's talking about the formulation of language and he's talking about the technological rationality that translates language into a more understandable form, but its translation is indicative of one perception, right? The example he gives is a worker saying wages are too low, and then the interpretation of that being like, this worker's condition of having to take care of his sick wife has made his, whatever.
Yeah.
Right? It's that same kind of thing here where, we're saying use the land and it's being translated through one lens, through this advanced industrial society into destroy the land.
Yeah.
It's no longer use, but extract, right? There's a difference in meaning there, right? That was interesting. The second thing I've already forgotten. So boom, glad I got the first one out in full.
Yeah. I kind of lost my point in that in the middle there also, but I do think words matter. And I do think, like, to a certain degree, the sort of work that he's trying to do here is valuable to, like, have concrete definitions from which we can all work. And the fact that we have to allow space for those definitions to be bound, because like you said, they can be usurped, assimilated, sublimated into having a different meaning than the intended meaning.
Yeah. I've kind of gotten my point back here, which is on page 164. This is actually where I wrote huge, so I'm glad. But it's that thing, one lens, one kind of practice. The scientific abstraction from concreteness, the quantification of qualities which yield exactness as well as universal validity, involve a specific concrete experience of the Lebenswelt, which just means practice, right? A specific mode of seeing the world. And this seeing, in spite of its pure, disinterested character, is seeing within a purposive, practical context. It is anticipating and projecting, right? That was an interesting thing where it reminded me of when I was talking about economics, where I said, if you can hold the assumptions, then you can make the prediction. That's the kind of practicality that technological rationality is instilling upon us, right? It's saying not only are we interpreting the initial characteristics, but we're also using those characteristics to then make a prediction. And that process is leading us to view the world in one way, in one practical matter. That's exactly what I was thinking earlier. And then he says, Galilean science is the science of methodical, systematic anticipation and projection, but, and this is decisive, of a specific anticipation and projection, right? It's prefiguring what they want to see. And I'm not saying that, that's something that Marcuse says here, is that the big success of Galilean science is the fact that its prediction has then been backed up with the practical side of things, right? The ideal is always backed up by the practice, right? The Lebenswelt. And so our interpretation of how society should interact with nature is backed up by our practice, but the thing is that practice is the practice of one interpretation of the anticipation of the results. Ugh, a crazy sentence, right? We are expecting specific actions and reactions based on the lens of the scientific apparatus. The difference is that there are other possibilities in society. Society is not so concrete. It is an ideal, as in there are alternatives possible. It's just that in our one-dimensional thinking, we can only see the one possibility. That brought it together more than anything else just now for me, I think. Yeah.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around a connection to the is-ought dilemma, the is-ought problem that he calls to a few times. I know that through the philosopher David Hume. Some people call it Hume's law even. And it's the idea of the is-ought dilemma is that we look at what is as an endorsement of the way things should be.
Yeah.
And so we use the conditions that we exist in as an endorsement of those conditions, which is obviously quite limiting, stops us from ever changing our attitudes, behaviors, relationships with nature, things like that. And I'm seeing a connection here, okay, to throw in one more philosophy thing, because he mentions a priori quite a lot.
Yes.
A priori is just a fancy way of talking about the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning. A priori means from reason alone.
Yeah.
So it's where you find your conclusion through your premises rather than starting with the conclusion and developing premises, which is a posteriori or whatever the fuck.
All right.
And you're pointing out the reversal that's happening here, where because of this one-dimensional thinking, because of this specific lens through which we are examining everything, we create these allowable circumstances. It's like we start with the conclusion and use that as justification. The ends becomes the means.
The ends and the means is exactly what I was thinking, because he does mention that. He does mention that here. It's also mentioned in that introduction I was reading where they were concerned with means ends thinking, that the ends absolve the means, right? Yeah. They were clearly more concerned with the means because the means are literally figuring modern society.
I don't know what I think about that right now, but that's why I'm trying to put all that together. This experience that I'm having right now is a pretty good encapsulation of my entire experience with this book, which is like there's something insightful in there, but it's nebulous. I just can't quite put my hand on it.
I really, really had to try hard not to look up external sources, to try to like watch a video or whatever, because I wanted this to be as most my personal experience as I could.
Yeah.
And I'm really glad we've gotten to have this discussion about it because it has helped to clarify some things. It doesn't change my standing on the book, though.
Same.
Yeah. Yo, 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 it's the cavalcade of quotes. Yeah, so the cavalcade of quotes. Lay it on me, Aaron.
On page 41, the dialectical logic insists against the language of brute facts and ideology that the slaves must be free for their liberation before they can become free, and that the end must be operative in the means to attain it. Socialism must become reality with the first act of the revolution because it must already be in the consciousness and action of those who carried the revolution. This idea that we must be free to find freedom, I think, is profound.
Yeah, I loved on the page before, page 40, where he's quoting Rousseau, and he says they must be forced to be free, right? To see objects as they are, and sometimes as they ought to appear, right? They must be shown the good road they're in search of.
Yep. He gives an interesting definition of labor on page 78, on page 72, which I think is kind of interesting. It's on the very bottom paragraph. In this society, not all the time spent on and with mechanisms is labor time. And he defines labor time as unpleasurable but necessary toil. That's a really interesting definition of labor to me, and I'm not sure I agree with it.
I'm just laughing because that's when he starts going into the saved libido of the machine. God. Okay, I understand that he's simply talking about instinctual energy, right? Energy that doesn't require thought to be acted upon. Mm-hmm. But man, those fucking Freud has done irreparable damage to our society. I don't actually believe that. Not to try to center psychoanalysis in the realm of actual therapy, but like modern therapy is so fucking stupid, dude. Like cognitive behavioral therapy, dumb.
My experience with it was not good.
Yeah, it seems like shit, and I don't know what the alternative is,
That was basically my experience in therapy is I'm like, all of these systemic issues are creating all of these terrible conditions for everyone on the world, and I'm carrying the weight and guilt of participating in a system like that. And she's like, but you do good, though. I'm like, okay, well.
Well, in the grand scheme of things, do I do any good, or am I just perpetuating the misery of myself and others?
Exactly. I'm like, I recognize intellectually what absurdism is, but I get mired in optimistic nihilism because I can't find my way to that I can't move my emotional response into a state of absurd acceptance.
Yeah.
And she's like, who's Camus? I'm like, okay.
Absurd acceptance. But doctor, I am the great Pagliacci.
Exactly. Curtains. On page 129, if truth presupposes freedom from toil, and if this freedom is in the social reality the prerogative of a minority, then the reality allows such a truth only in approximation and for a privileged group. This state of affairs contradicts the universal character of truth, which defines and prescribes not only a theoretical goal, but the best life of man qua man with respect to the essence of man. Truth and freedom being in conflict to the point that truth is no longer even truth. Very philosopher thing to get concerned with, but I really did like that quote.
Oh, I love on page 192, he's talking a little bit about art as the, something that contains the abstract, right? Something that contains the antithesis, the realm of thought that's allowed to broach the negative and is still permissible in society, right? That whole top paragraph, pretty good. But then he says, yeah, certainly, someone's saying to the poet, certainly you may speak your own language, but it must be translatable. And it will be translated. You may speak poetry, that is all right. We love poetry, but we want to understand your poetry, and we can only do so if we can interpret your symbols, metaphors, and images in the sets of ordinary language. To which the poet might answer that indeed he wants his poetry to be understandable and understood, that's why he writes it, but if what he says could be said in terms of ordinary language, he probably would have done so in the first place. That's great. That's a good one. It's like, why do art? Because art is the only method of expression that works here.
Yeah. As a fan of abstract expressionism, that speaks to me a lot as well. I think a lot of people think of that as hoity-toity and meaningless art or whatever. But I like it, and I think because abstract expressionism, when done well, can express the otherwise unexpressible.
Yeah. There's a great comic of a guy walking up to like a Pollock and going, what does this mean? And then the painting yells back at him, what do you mean? It's really good.
On page 135, I think Marcuse gives a fair criticism of philosophy when he writes, those who bore the brunt of the untrue reality and who therefore seem to be most in need of attaining its subversion were not the concern of philosophy. Philosophy has a tendency to be things that the elite can practice, and the folks that need the fruit of that philosophy the most aren't even a concern to most philosophers. I think that's a really fair criticism, and historically has been very, very true.
Yeah. A little further down, with the exception of the materialistic heretics, philosophic thought was rarely afflicted by the afflictions of human existence. That's pretty fun. Yeah, when somebody actually says my broom is in the corner, he probably intends that somebody else who had actually asked about the broom is going to take it or leave it there, right? The language itself doesn't impart the meaning. It's the proof of the eating is in the pudding, right? Actually, I wrote that down somewhere else. But he's saying that the connections between the language are what actually makes it have meaning, not the words itself.
Not the words themselves, yeah. Yep.
That's pretty good.
Okay, I was looking for this quote earlier. I don't remember the context, but it's on page 228.
All right.
He's talking about this fella, A.N. Whitehead, but he says, capital R, reason. Reason is still to be discovered, recognized, and realized, for hitherto the historical function of reason has also been to repress and even destroy the urge to live well, and to live better, or to postpone and put an exorbitantly high price on the fulfillment of this urge. Which I think is an interesting development of this failure of this realm of thinking.
Yeah. There's something, it makes me think of earlier where he says that, man, if I speak of the mind of a person, I do not merely refer to his mental processes as they are revealed in his expression, speech, or behavior, nor merely of his dispositions or faculties as experienced or inferred. I also mean that which he does not express, for which he shows no disposition, but which is present nevertheless, and which determines to a considerable extent his behavior, his understanding, the formation and range of his concepts. Thus, negatively present are the specific environmental forces which precondition the mind for spontaneous repulsion of certain data. They're present as repelled material. So it just kind of made me think it's like, not only is what the person accepts as a part of that person, but it's also part of what they reject.
Yep. There's your Joe Doe and Richard Rowe also.
Yeah. He talks about Joe Doe and Richard Rowe a lot because he says so often that this simplified speech is reductive. It's not actually, much in the same way that Joe Doe and Richard Rowe are reductive of actual people. They're not fucking real people. They're just dickheads on the street, you know? Like a Goofus and Gallant character.
Okay, well, that was One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse. Any questions that this text left you with?
What the fuck? No. No, I don't know. What other forms of society does Marcuse have in mind? this made me a little more interested in the history of the New Left, and maybe their organizational flaws. I'm interested in his critique of Soviet communism, which we didn't really talk about that much.
Yeah, we didn't really get into.
Yeah, but not really.
Yeah, same. There are a handful of spaces where I wrote a question mark in the margin, but that's just because I found his rhetoric to be inscrutable.
Right.
It doesn't leave me with grander questions, per se. So, given that, do you think it was worth reading this book?
No.
Yeah, this is my first hard no as well.
I think it's I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think it is a soft no for me still. I do think that if I was more of a fucking wanker and I had better philosophical basis, I could have really enjoyed this. Because, like I said, the beginning and the end, I was cruising,
Yeah.
It wasn't greater than the sum of its parts, I'll say that much.
I think that's a great way to put it. I really enjoyed the introduction.
Yeah.
And I was so down based on the introduction, because even the opening of the introduction is a banger line. Does not the threat of an atomic catastrophe which could wipe out the human race also serve to protect the very forces which perpetuate this danger? It's like, damn, okay, we're going right into it.
Yeah.
But I think he just gets so lost in the sauce. I just don't think it's worth the effort. Having already read Society of the Spectacle, I feel like got a lot of these ideas from DeBow. And so the whole time I just kept comparing it to that in my mind. And so my answer would be, don't read this, read that.
Right. Now that we've recorded, I am going to go fucking watch a YouTube video, dude. I am going to go watch a video essay so I can actually try to I feel that we got a pretty good comprehension of his main idea, but if I want to know the specifics, I'm not going to read any more Marcuse. I think I'm going to go to another source.
Yeah, and I feel confident that we didn't pick up everything. We didn't catch all of the nuance. I do think that we got a pretty good foundation of what his central theses are about one-dimensional and two-dimensional thinking.
It did impart something on me,
Same.
The idea of becoming domination is an interesting one. And it is one that will weigh on my determination of what maybe our society should look like, just as a whole.
Yep, but I'd say skip it.
Yeah, you don't need to read it. Fuck you, Herbert.
Okay, given that, next time we're going to read
The Transitional Program by Leon Trotsky.
Yes, a little return to Trot.
Yeah, this was very philosophical, this piece, and I kind of want something more concrete, and I think it'll be interesting to see what Trotsky's saying needs to be done post-revolution.
Yes, and I think, if you spend enough time in online spaces, you'll get a lot of anti-Trotsky kind of rhetoric. And so far from having read The Permanent Revolution, I don't see a rational basis in that. I think, as you'd said off mic before, I think a lot of those are ad hominem attacks. Yep. And if there's a significant issue with this theory, I want to know where it is and why.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find it.
Am I going to have to read a polemic to do that? In which case, how can I separate that from the shitty-ass history, I feel like Stalin's writings about Trotsky are likely biased by it being from Stalin, or other contemporary Bolsheviks. I think that just like how we, in The Permanent Revolution from Karl Radek, how he was writing polemically about Trotsky. It's like, I don't think that was at the behest of Karl Radek's intellectual fervor. I think it came from the fact that he was appeasing Stalin. Yeah,
so I'm curious to read a little bit more Trotsky.
Yeah, I'm ready to get the second Trotsky out of the way. That way we can declare that he's a fucking moron.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I'm waiting for. I'm just waiting to affirm the fact that he was expelled for a good reason and not because he was a bitchless, rizless loser. Like, what can I say?
Little column A, little column B, I guess.
Why not both? Yeah. Okay, cool. Anyway, let us know how we did. If you have questions, if we missed questions, right? If we misinterpreted something. I mean, this book especially, what the fuck was I talking about? What else should we read?
Yeah, any recommendations for future reading? We have a long list of stuff we can read.
Like I said earlier, if you're a critical theorist and you're saying these knucklehead Stalinists just fucking missed the memo, then tell us. If I need to read something else to get it figured out, let me know what that other thing is at least.
Yeah, and we'll consider it.
Yeah.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com. Anyway, this has been Left Unread. Don't get left unread. No.
Bye.
Take it easy. Just to say, there was a third person on this podcast, and it was the other dickhead that owned this book because he fucking underlined so much in this.
Oh, really?
And it was always the part that I didn't care about. So fuck you, other guy.